thing we have to fear is
in war,
fear itself.
there is no substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we've earned, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome to the intersection of faith and politics. This is WallBuilders Live. Thanks for joining us today. Rick Green here with David Barton. And David, yesterday we had Ken Ivory with us from Utah talking about the federal lands, the growth of the federal government, and the abuse of power through these federal lands. I learned a lot yesterday. There was so much good information. We're going to get him back again today.
Yeah, it's going to be fun because he does have a wealth of information, and he has a way of looking at things that really kind of are logical, you know, and they should be, because the way this was laid out by the founders was based on principles. And as long as
logical, that must be why we have a conservative audience, because logic only makes sense to conservative. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that, but go ahead.
And that's why it's also a federal problem, because logic is not involved with it. So if you could get logic involved, you could solve a lot of the federal problems. And, you know, logic is one of the things that tends to go with conservatives, at least in having thought things through. We tend not to stick with platitudes and sound bites and other things. We want to go back to jurisdictions and principles and larger issues. And so in looking at that as opposed to an agenda, that's what Ken's really good at. He goes back and he looks at the history that so many people say, oh, who cares about the history of how these states came in the United States? Well, you care a whole lot when the federal government is claiming 81% of your state belongs to them. Or what was it in Utah, 68% or whatever. I mean, you care a lot. And so he's one of the guys who wades back into that stuff in a very good sense and then brings it out and puts it in a very digestible form so that anybody can say, oh, I understand why this is an issue. I understand what's going on in Nevada. And they call it the war in the West. There's really 17 states that the federal government has really gone after and say, hey, we want to own who you are and what you do. So it's now the war in the West, and he's one of the best spokesmen that I know on this issue. And it'll be really fun to see how he handles it today as well.
State Representative Ken Ivory from Utah back with us today when we return here on WallBuilders Live. Hey friends, this is Rick Green, and I want to share with you a phenomenal opportunity for your family. David Barton and I both have family members experiencing this right now. It's called College Plus, and it is the best program out there for saving your family a tremendous amount of money on college education for your children, but more importantly, years of their life, and getting them in touch with their purpose, their greatest calling that God has on their life right now. And this is not some mail-order college degree, folks. I'm talking about getting your degree from places like Liberty University or Concordia University or Bryan College, I mean, great colleges and universities, and other ones as well. My son Trey's doing it right now at only 16 years old. He's already a sophomore in college. It's been a phenomenal experience for our family. No age requirements, folks. You can do College Plus as well, regardless of your age. You got to check it out right now at wallbuilderslive.com.
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. In the case Abingdon versus Shemp, the Supreme Court ruled that the Bible could no longer be an independent textbook in public school curriculum. Would our founding fathers have agreed? Benjamin Rush certainly would have disagreed. Benjamin Rush was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he was a leading educator of the day. In fact, he was the first founding father to call for free public schools. Benjamin Rush declared, "The great enemy of the salvation of man, in my opinion, never invented a more effective means of extinguishing Christianity from the world than by persuading mankind that it was improper to read the Bible at schools. The Bible should be read in our schools in preference to all other books." In the view of founding father Benjamin Rush, the Bible was the textbook of preference for public schools.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome back to the intersection of faith and politics. WallBuilders Live, thanks for staying with us today. And by the way, yesterday was so good with Representative Ken Ivory out of Utah. After we got off the air, we got to talking about some of the jurisdictional things and issues and all the other research that he's been working on. We said, man, we got to cover more of this, so we got him back today. Ken, thanks for coming back on, bro.
Thanks, Rick. My pleasure.
Hey, we were talking off air about just the jurisdictional issues, and you brought up something I had no idea had even occurred, and it had to do with Eisenhower and essentially a very involved study on the issue of jurisdiction in federal lands. Tell us about it.
Yeah, that's right, Rick. Back in the early 50s, there was a state that had a big VA hospital in the middle of it, and it was a federal enclave. Article 1, Section 817, forts, batteries, dockyards, bought with the consent of the state legislature. Well, they don't pay taxes on that land, and so the state decided, well, if you're not paying taxes, your kids can't come to our school. And the administration got pretty worked up about that and said, we've got to understand and study this whole issue about jurisdiction over federal areas within the states, right, power, and authority of the states, or right, power, and governing authority, jurisdiction, right? So they do this most comprehensive study on jurisdiction over federal areas within the states that's ever been done before or since. And so by 1957 through 1962, they do this study. Now, here's what they find out. The general rule, now this is the general rule, is that the states have jurisdiction, the governing right, power, and authority for health, safety, and welfare. It's also called the police power. The states have jurisdiction over everything within the boundaries of their state unless there's an exception. And in this report that was done by the U.S. Attorney General, all of the states' attorneys general, the Comptroller General of the United States, 33 federal agencies, they studied 1,000 different cases in every text and periodical on the subject. And they said, okay, there are three exceptions. One is Article 1, Section 817 of the Constitution. It's a federal enclave. That's when it was bought by Congress with the consent of the state legislature, and it's for forts, batteries, arsenals, dockyards, other needful buildings. That's exception number one. That's exclusive legislative jurisdiction to the federal government. Exception number two is what they called concurrent jurisdiction. And that's where, again, the state legislature says, we agree to share our jurisdiction with you, federal government. And then the third exception was what they called partial jurisdiction. And that's where, again, the state legislature says, we will allow you to use some small measure of our jurisdiction. Now, notice this, Rick, it always comes from the state. The state has jurisdiction, and they choose to either concede or share jurisdiction with the federal government in some manner.
Before you go on, Ken, help me again with those three categories. The first one, easy to think about examples of that, just even a base would probably be an easy example. What's a good example on the second one where there's concurrent jurisdiction?
So that may be like a national park or something where the state still has jurisdiction, but they allow the federal government to do certain things jurisdictionally.
Yeah, okay.
And partial would be similar as well, something where the federal government exercises some minimal amount of governing authority, but really they just own the land. And so then the fourth category is critical, Rick. The fourth category, they said, was not jurisdictional at all. They called it mere proprietorial interest only. And they said that's where the federal government has some ownership or interest in the land, but they have no authority, no jurisdiction in the manner of a state. They're like any other landowner, except that they're a government.
So they don't have the authority to come in and do, for instance, what happened with Bundy, bring in, armed, tactical teams. They're no different than any other neighbor. If I had a dispute with you in my neighborhood, then that's the type of thing you're talking about. It's two landowners have a dispute.
Exactly right. So what other landowner would come in and say, hey, I have a fence line dispute with you. I'm going to bring in tanks and helicopters and machine guns. No, it's the government that deals with that. And Rick, the Supreme Court, less than 2 years ago, the Supreme Court said that the jurisdiction over health, safety, welfare, that's also known as the police power, the Supreme Court said the jurisdiction for the police power is possessed by the states, but not the federal government. They said this independent power of the states serves as a check on the arbitrary power of the federal government. And then they said this, Rick, states are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they have to act like it.
They basically do your job.
Yeah, exactly right. That's the United States Supreme Court, Rick. I mean, this is rule of law. This is what we're talking about.
Yeah. So you know, if tell me if I'm picturing this wrong, because I haven't researched this, but it sounds like to me the right way to have handled even the Bundy situation would have been more like a civil case, and for the government to have come in and said, we've got a judgment that says that the grazing fees need to be paid, and people do need to be reminded. I mean, this was not Bundy's land. He didn't own it. This was not a private property fight over something he owned. This was public land that he had been grazing on for however long, and at one time did pay fees and whatnot. And so if they get these federal judgment that says he owes money for these fees, who would have the jurisdiction then to enforce that? Should they not have come in to, say, the local sheriff's department like you would if you had a tenant that you were trying to get out of your apartment that wasn't paying their bills?
Yeah, Rich, so you've done some legal work in your time, right? How many judgments have you gotten where you called in helicopters and machine guns to enforce it?
Wait, let me think. Hang on. No, not. Yeah, it would be zero. Yeah.
That would be zero, right?
Yeah.
So yes. I mean, this idea of jurisdiction. Now, you got a couple different points going on. First of all, let me say that this study, it's called Jurisdiction Over Federal Areas Within the States. There's a 250-page brief to policymakers, and then there's a 250-page legal brief. Hundreds and hundreds of cases. That's on the American Lands Council website. You can find that there. Go through that now. In Utah.
Now remind us of that website we gave out yesterday to get directly to you guys.
Yeah, so AmericanLandsCouncil.org. There's an S in there, AmericanLandsCouncil.org. So now in Utah, after they did this study, right, you had all the top lawyers in the United States, the U.S. Attorney General, all the states' attorneys general, 33 federal agencies. They do this comprehensive study, and in fact, they say this is the most comprehensive study ever done on the subject. Then they had the GSA, the Government Services Administration, go out and catalog every single acre of federal land down to the 10th of an acre into those 4 categories. And so the GSA goes out and works with all the states, and they put all the land in these different categories. Well, guess what? In Utah, Rick, 99% of all the federal areas within the state of Utah, Category 4, mere proprietorial interest only, no authority in the manner of the state. They're just like any other landowner.
Wow. Now give us a good example of that Category 4. I mean, what kind of land fits that description there?
Well, so all this land that's at issue in the Bundy case, all the BLM, all the Forest Service land, they all fall into that category. In fact, in Utah, even the national parks and monuments, still by the federal government's own classification, fall into Category 4, proprietorial interest only, no jurisdiction. Now, why that matters is the issue of jurisdiction, that decides who's the government, because in our system of federalism, it's a governing partnership.
Yeah, so who gets the authority for that particular area? Who's going to enforce whatever?
That's right, because if you have the state and the federal government showing up with tanks and machine guns and tear gas at every situation, first of all, the states wouldn't do that. But you've got the federal government showing up with helicopters and machine guns. The founders realized that this partnership, you need to approach that line very cautiously, very circumspectly, they said, in approaching that jurisdictional line. In fact, they said that James Wilson, you know James Wilson, right? The original Supreme Court founder, signer of the Declaration, signer of the Constitution, he said, we drew the line with as much accuracy as we could. This should be praised for the accuracy which we drew the line between the state and the federal government. And so that's critical, this idea of where's that line. We've got to know that. So very critical stuff. So that comes into play in the Bundy situation. Think about this, Rick. If you have a problem with the construction of a house, but what you know is that the foundation was built completely improperly, negligently, and so now you go build the house on that terrible foundation, well, you're going to have a terrible house. And you can't go back and say, oh, the framer or the plumber or the electrician, it's all your fault. No, you go back to the foundation. So you look at the Bundy situation. The foundation is that the federal government made the exact same statehood promise to Nevada and all the other western states that it did to North and South Dakota and Nebraska and Louisiana and Alabama to transfer title to those public lands at statehood. And so that foundation, the federal government has failed to honor that promise and created this horrible foundation. And now they want to come in and say, they want to play the blame game and act in a purely civil matter in the most egregious, uncivilized manner. What kind of government is that?
Man, Ken, you put so many things in perspective for me here that I had been struggling with, because, and you explain it, and you explain exactly right too, because it all comes back to that foundation, and it seems like almost every major problem and challenge we're facing, an overreach of government, comes back to jurisdiction. It always comes back to, do they have the authority and the jurisdiction to do it in the first place? All the spending, all the programs, everything they're doing right now that's outside of those clear jurisdictional lines, which you just described. I mean, as James Wilson said, I mean, they made it as clear as they possibly could. But I had not thought about it, this Bundy issue and the federal lands issue, from the standpoint of, it's one thing for the federal government to have property there that they may, quote unquote, manage, but they're not the authority. It's not their jurisdiction from a government perspective. I never thought about that. And I can't imagine that most members of Congress even think about that. I mean, how many people even know that study, what was it, 60 years ago, I guess, when this took place?
1962 is when they finished the GSA studies. But Rick, get this. If you do a search on Google or whatever for proprietorial interest, that is still in the Army Field Service manuals, the Department of Interior manuals, in the Government Accountability Office manuals. They still use those terms today. It's just that we don't understand them. In fact, the BLM officer that was on the ground in Nevada, I was in a meeting with him 2 weeks before that all started happening in our legislature, talking about, there was a law enforcement issue where the BLM officer shot and killed a young African-American man on State Road outside of Las Vegas. He was going to the sheriff deputy, and they said, we thought he was going to grab the sheriff's gun. And they shot him 9 times.
Wow.
And so we were having investigations into this jurisdiction of law enforcement. And this guy, this Dan Love that was on the ground there, he kept saying over and over again, we have proprietary jurisdiction. We have proprietary jurisdiction. He kept using that term. And finally, when I got a chance, I said, excuse me, Special Agent Love, can you tell me what the scope of this proprietary jurisdiction, as you call it, is? And can you tell me where that jurisdiction comes from? And man, Dan, he backpedaled so dang fast, he gave a song and dance for about 10 minutes because he doesn't know. But they'll use that term as if this is how we have unlimited authority to act. So we have to know. Jurisdiction we don't know is no better than jurisdiction we don't have. And this is coming right home to Texas, because right now you got this BLM run amok in the West. They're coming to Texas and trying to say that 90,000 acres that is in dispute between the Texas-Oklahoma line, they said, well, we'll just come take that 90,000 acres. And your Attorney General, Abbott, just shot him off a letter and said, not so fast. You better explain to me where you get your authority, where this comes from, and why you have any right at all in this issue. So, you give them an inch and they'll walk all over you.
No doubt. Do you think, Ken, we've gotten to this point where we just assume, even as you describe that phrase, all we hear is jurisdiction. We don't pay attention to what that word before it means. Is it because we've repeated so many times Fed trumps state that we now assume that Fed trumps state in every situation, no matter what, when that's not actually true? It doesn't always trump state. There's times when the state trumps Fed.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So if you look at Federalist 39, which was quoted by the Supreme Court in 1997 in a case called Prince versus the United States, they quoted that and said the municipal authorities have a separate and independent portion of the supremacy, no more subject to the general authority within its sphere than the general authority is subject to it within its sphere. So the question is, the states in its sphere, supreme. Federal government in its limited sphere, supreme. But the feds come out, and what they teach in law school these days is supremacy means whatever the federal government says goes. Well, that's a totalitarian government. That's not this governing partnership that was the unprecedented system, I would say divinely inspired. One of the most divinely inspired aspects of our system is this governing partnership between the state and the federal government.
Is there a way to get well, you said on your website that study is available. Is that something you would recommend that our listeners get into the hands of their state legislators and their congressmen? I mean, we do have a handful of good congressmen that do look at these things from a very constitutional point of view that may not be familiar with this particular area. I mean, I had no idea this Eisenhower study was out there. So is that something you recommend that we, copy, download, link, whatever, and make sure that the representatives, both at the state and federal level, begin to study this thing. I think most, I can't think of hardly anybody. I've never talked to anybody about this. They cannot be aware of this, and it's got to be good ammunition for those that want to put the feds back into their proper jurisdiction.
Yeah, absolutely right. If we don't know what the line is, Thomas Jefferson said it must be the states themselves erecting barriers at the constitutional line that cannot be surmounted. It's on us, right? We're part of this government. This is how it works. We hire, we delegate our governing authority of the people, by the people, for the people, and we delegate that to representatives that we hire. They have to know these things. So absolutely, Rick, it's called Jurisdiction Over Federal Areas Within the States. There's 2 volumes that are on the website. Then there's also the GSA studies and some other things. AmericanLandsCouncil.org. And, if you can, when you're on there, help us out. Hit the donate button and help us continue to do this work and put this kind of information out there.
No doubt. And encourage folks right now, visit that website, AmericanLandsCouncil.org. And we're going to have a link today at WallBuildersLive.com to make it easy to get there. We'll also have a link to those studies. But get on that website if you can, donate and help, and continue to get this information out there. Download some of these things, send links to your legislators, your congressmen. I think we're scratching the surface today, but it's just like everything else. The history is on our side, the precedent is on our side, but we don't know it. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say I knew nothing about this study that Eisenhower did, and it sounds to me like it makes it crystal clear how wrong the federal government is and what they're doing right now in these areas, and exactly how we need to get them back into their proper place. Ken Ivory, as always, it's been an educational experience just to get to interview you, bro. I appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure, Rick.
That's State Representative Ken Ivory from Utah. Back in a moment with David Barton. Red, White, Blue, and Green is a new reality show following the Green family around the nation, rediscovering the American principles that made us the most successful nation in the history of the world. You can be a part of launching this new reality series by visiting rickgreen.com and clicking on the Red, White, Blue, and Green tab. Here's a sneak peek from the pilot episode. Rick Green coming to you live from the Lone Star State of Texas, a beacon of hope and freedom to liberty lovers around the world. Today I'm thinking about why do we do what we do? Because everywhere we go as a family, when we're traveling and speaking, someone comes up to us and asks, where's the hope? Is it over for America? They genuinely feel like the stars and stripes are fading. I felt that. But when I look at my family, whether it's my son Trey and his drive to exceed expectations, or Reagan and his love for serving and teaching other people, Cameron and her determination to outperform her brothers in everything she does, or my little stagehound Rhett and his boundless enthusiasm. Through their eyes, I see a vibrant nation. When my children stand in the birthplace of the Constitution, or on battlefields where patriots gave their lives, I can see in them a rekindled flame of the American spirit. The future of my children's country is bright because it's built on the foundation of an incredible providential history. A history of patriots and pastors, entrepreneurs and freedom fighters, mothers, fathers, families like yours and mine, who chose to live like their nation depended on it. And it still does. So when people ask us, where is the hope? We tell them, it's in you. Each of us, every individual, every family, has a duty to fight for freedom and add our voice, our color, to the American dream. For our family, it's red, white, and blue, and a little bit of green. To learn more about red, white, blue, and green, visit rickgreen.com.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. We're back with David Barton now. David, I tell you, one of the things that excites me the most about all of this is it's a peaceable means to solve many of our problems. You know, you've said many times, I mean, we have the tools right there in the Constitution. You don't have to have a revolution with bullets. You can have a revolution with ballots. I mean, it's all right there. If we'll just use the Constitution, we can solve these big problems.
And, you know, the thing the Constitution established so clearly was jurisdictional lines. And that's what always made limited government. If you don't understand where the lines are drawn and what you can and can't do, then you don't have limited government. I've used the example before of, you know, I've got my What's your pickup? It's a GMC. It's gray, isn't it? You got it. What's your pickup, Rick?
I have a Dodge.
Dodge. That's it, Dodge. And
I have. I mean, it's a mean-looking Dodge Ram too. I love it.
And see, I've got this red Ford pickup, and so I like red, so I go over and spray paint your truck red. I can't do that. That's not my property. It's not my jurisdiction. And if you understand jurisdictional lines, good fences make good neighbors, and that's where the federal government is exceeding all of its boundaries because, quite frankly, we don't know where the property lines are ourselves. When somebody comes on our property, we don't say, wait a minute, you're off your property. You step back over here. And that's what Ken points out, and that's the history that he points out that's so good, is where these property lines were established, where the boundaries are, where the jurisdiction is. You know, it's not in my jurisdiction to go over and turn your Dodge into a Ford, and it's not my jurisdiction to turn a gray one into a red one. I can't do that. And until we as citizens recover some of the stuff that he's talking about, it's going to be hard to push the feds back onto their property and get them on their side of the fence. But what he's doing is so effective because he is getting a national voice right now. He is being able to articulate this to national audiences, and he's just done so with us in our 200 stations. So now there's a whole lot more folks that are equipped to go out and be able to handle this. Bundy's not the issue. The issue is federal jurisdiction. And as long as we can keep it on that, that's a battle we can win.
Man, you made such a great point. We have to know ourselves as citizens. Somebody walks on your property, you don't know if they've crossed the property line. If you don't know the property line, we've got to learn those jurisdictional lines. That means studying the Constitution, studying the history. We as the citizens get informed, we'll get a better government out of it as well. Thanks for joining us today on WallBuilders Live.
We stand undivided.